The war was over. The cessation of hostilities brought an end to the fighting and the vast machinery that sustained it, but it also left behind a pressing question: what to do with the remnants of the war? This question loomed particularly large when it came to the German V-weapons, the technologically advanced missiles, rockets, and flying bombs that had terrorized Europe during the final stages of the conflict. These weapons, though partially obsolete by the time of Germany's surrender, were now prized for their technological value, a legacy of Nazi ambition that spurred both wonder and fear. Yet, the fate of the captured V-weapons after the war was not one of heroics or grand international negotiations. It was instead a process dominated by expedience, economic pressure, and a global scramble for scientific advantage. At the heart of this was the scale of the stockpiles. In the final years of the war, Nazi Germany produced thousands of V-2 rockets, and the V-1 flying bombs were launched in hundreds of waves against targets across Britain, France, and Belgium. The remnants of these weapons, along with documentation, testing equipment, and manufacturing facilities, were scattered across Europe by the time the war ended. The task of dealing with them was nothing short of monumental. In the immediate aftermath of the war, both the Allies and the Soviet Union saw the V-weapons as invaluable assets. The race to capture as much of this technology as possible began almost immediately. But beyond the weaponry itself, the war had created a landscape of ruin, and the practical concerns of repurposing or even storing these weapons were pressing. Factories were in disarray, transportation networks inoperative, and even the most basic resources, steel, labor, and fuel, were in short supply. The priority was not simply the weapons themselves but the knowledge they contained, the potential to understand and exploit their capabilities. The first significant step in managing the V-weapon stockpiles came through the actions of the Allied forces. Within weeks of the German surrender, both British and American teams began searching for and securing the V-2 rockets and related materials. Over 3,000 V-2 rockets had been produced by the time of Germany's defeat, with several hundred more in various stages of completion. The Allies seized large quantities of these rockets, along with the technical documentation, testing data, and even the scientists who had developed them. In particular, Operation Paperclip, an American initiative, became the vehicle through which many of the scientists and engineers involved in the development of the V-weapons were transported to the United States. Among them was Wernher von Braun, the most prominent figure in Nazi Germany's rocket program. The United States, having already determined that its primary goal was to use the captured V-2 technology for its own missile and space programs, was eager to secure not only the hardware but also the intellectual capital behind it. The U.S. would go on to build an extensive rocket program, ultimately leading to the development of the Redstone missile and later the Saturn rockets that would take astronauts to the moon. In Britain, however, the situation was different. The British were initially less focused on the intellectual property of the V-weapons and more concerned with neutralizing the threat they posed. The Ministry of Supply, which had already been overseeing the acquisition of German weaponry, was tasked with dealing with the captured V-1 and V-2 stockpiles. A significant portion of the V-1s, which were simpler in design and easier to manufacture, were dismantled or sent for testing, while the rockets of the V-2 class were studied but often not repurposed in the same way as in the United States. Despite the initial efforts to repurpose some of the V-2 technology for military use, the practical costs of continuing these programs were prohibitive, especially as Britain was recovering from the wartime economy and struggling with post-war rationing. Even with the successful acquisition of the rocket technology, the logistics of handling the enormous quantities of captured material were overwhelming. The immediate post-war years saw widespread scrapping of unused missiles and parts, as maintaining large stockpiles of these sophisticated weapons was economically untenable. The V-1s, in particular, were of limited use after the war, and many were simply dismantled. The British, for example, scrapped much of their stockpile, but they did retain a number for further evaluation, particularly to assess the potential for air defense or retaliatory strikes. Still, with a shortage of skilled labor and the constant demand for resources to rebuild a shattered economy, the priority was not to keep large numbers of these rockets in service, but rather to examine them, learn from them, and move on. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, took a different approach. They were particularly interested in the V-2 rockets, which were seen as a key stepping stone to the Soviet Union's own ballistic missile program. The Soviets, operating under the auspices of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, managed to seize substantial quantities of V-2 rockets and related materials from the Germans in the final months of the war. Their objective was to reverse engineer the technology, adapt it to Soviet needs, and gain a technological advantage over the West. But the Soviets also faced significant challenges in terms of infrastructure, manpower, and the availability of raw materials. Much of the initial work on the V-2 was carried out in secret, with Soviet engineers working in makeshift facilities and under tight security. Despite these obstacles, by the late 1940s, the Soviet Union had successfully replicated much of the V-2's design and begun testing their own version of the missile. While the V-weapons were a source of technological and military competition, they also became a source of geopolitical tension. The United States and the Soviet Union were not only vying for control of the V-weapon stockpiles but also seeking to monopolize the knowledge and expertise that came with them. This drove much of the initial post-war decision-making. There were official programs aimed at consolidating control over the rockets, but much of the effort was ad hoc, driven by military needs and political considerations rather than any coherent strategy for the future of the weapons themselves. Meanwhile, across the continent, in Germany, the situation was one of devastation and upheaval. The very factories that had produced the V-1 and V-2 rockets were now either in ruins or under Allied control. The German economy, already ravaged by the war, faced an immediate collapse. The factories that had once churned out the rockets were now either scrapped or repurposed to produce more conventional goods. The towns and cities that had housed the rocket programs, such as Peenemünde, where the V-2 was first developed, were now under Allied occupation, and the once mighty infrastructure of the Nazi war machine lay in ruins. As the United States and the Soviet Union jockeyed for technological supremacy, the sheer scale of the task of handling and dismantling the remnants of Nazi rocket science meant that much was simply abandoned. The forgotten pieces of the V-weapons, unsalvageable missiles, leftover rocket parts, and testing equipment were often left to rust in the open air or buried in fields, their significance lost to the scramble for more tangible military advantage. The economic costs, along with the growing realization that the V-weapons were more of a historical relic than a functional military asset, ensured that many of these items were not kept for long. Yet, the true impact of the V-weapons on the post-war world was just beginning to unfold. Although their immediate military value was often overstated, their legacy, both in terms of the technology they represented and the knowledge they carried, would go on to shape the Cold War and the space race, where the future of humanity's reach into space would be influenced by the breakthroughs of German scientists and engineers. But in the meantime, the captured stockpiles were in the process of being rapidly dismantled, with many of their parts simply discarded in favor of more practical priorities. The fate of the V-weapons was not one of dramatic destruction or immediate obsolescence, but rather one of slow, bureaucratic attrition, a series of decisions driven by the practicalities of post-war survival. As the world turned its attention to rebuilding, the legacy of these weapons faded into the background, overshadowed by the larger concerns of a world recovering from the ravages of war. The aftermath of the German V-weapons stockpiles did not end with their immediate seizure and dismantling. As the world entered the Cold War era, the remnants of Nazi Germany's V-weaponry took on new dimensions, influencing global politics, technology, and military doctrine. The weapons themselves, though no longer seen as a direct military threat, served as a starting point for the rapid advancements in missile technology, both in the United States and the Soviet Union. Their fate would become a symbol of the geopolitical competition that defined much of the post-war era. In the United States, the captured V-2 rockets and the accompanying knowledge were quickly integrated into the nascent American missile program. The U.S. military recognized that these rockets were more than just remnants of a defeated enemy. They were the key to unlocking a new frontier in warfare and space exploration. The scientists who had worked on the V-2 under the Third Reich, including the now famous Wernher von Braun, were brought to the U.S. under Operation Paperclip, where they played a central role in shaping the country's missile and space programs. By the late 1940s, the U.S. Army had already begun testing and modifying the V-2 technology. The immediate goal was to develop a reliable and effective missile for military use, especially as tensions with the Soviet Union began to escalate. This led to the creation of the Redstone missile, which was based directly on the V-2's design. The Redstone missile would later serve as the launch vehicle for America's first astronauts, and it would play a key role in the early years of the U.S. space program. It was not simply an adaptation of the V-2 technology but a refinement that would lay the groundwork for the future of missile and space exploration. The most significant of these developments was the creation of the space program. The V-2 rockets, despite their crude nature and limited range, demonstrated the feasibility of rocket-powered flight. For the United States, the realization that the technology could be harnessed for peaceful purposes was transformative. The foundations of the space race, which would come to define the Cold War era, were laid with the acquisition and adaptation of the V-2 technology. Von Braun, who had once designed rockets for Hitler's regime, became one of the most important figures in the American space program, ultimately leading the development of the Saturn rockets that carried humans to the moon. In the Soviet Union, the fate of the captured V-weapons took a somewhat different path. Like the United States, the Soviets had long been aware of the military potential of rocketry. The Soviet Union had its own rocket program, but it was not as advanced as the German efforts by the time of the war's end. The V-2, with its ability to reach targets hundreds of kilometers away, was a weapon of immense strategic value. As the Soviet Union absorbed vast amounts of technology and knowledge from its German and American counterparts, it quickly set about replicating and improving upon the designs of the V-2. The Soviet Union's primary interest was military. The Soviet leadership saw the V-2 as a potential game-changer in the context of the Cold War, particularly as tensions with the United States began to build. However, the Soviet approach to rocket development was marked by secrecy and state control. The Soviets quickly built upon the V-2's design, creating their own version, which they named the R-1. This rocket would serve as the foundation for the Soviet Union's missile program, which would later evolve into the R-7 Semyorka, the first intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, capable of reaching the United States. In this way, the V-2 would indirectly contribute to the escalation of the arms race between the two superpowers. Yet, despite the Soviet Union's immediate military priorities, they also recognized the broader potential of rocket technology. By the mid-1950s, the Soviets were experimenting with the possibility of using their ballistic missile technology for space exploration. The R-7 missile, which had been developed as a military weapon, was adapted to launch the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, into orbit in 1957. This was a direct consequence of the knowledge and experience that had been gleaned from the V-2 and other German rockets. The race for space dominance, which would dominate the Cold War for decades to come, had its origins in the stockpiles of V-weaponry that had been captured at the war's end. The fate of the V-weapon stockpiles, however, was not entirely shaped by military priorities. In Europe, particularly in Germany, the destruction of these weapons marked the end of an era. The remnants of the V-weapons, scattered across the continent, were seen as a symbol of both the destructive power of war and the Nazi regime's overreach. The factories that had once produced the rockets were now in ruins, and the labor force that had been mobilized to build them had been either killed or displaced. The Allied powers, despite their initial interest in the technology, recognized that maintaining these weapons was neither practical nor politically desirable. Many of the V-1 flying bombs, for example, were simply dismantled or destroyed in the immediate post-war period. The V-2 rockets, while more advanced, were similarly stripped of valuable components, many of which were either sent to the United States or the Soviet Union for further study. The launch sites, which had once been the epicenter of the V-weapon attacks on Britain and other Allied targets, were abandoned, left to fall into disrepair. In the case of Peenemünde, the site where the V-2 was first developed, the once bustling complex was reduced to a shadow of its former self, a relic of the past. The environmental and economic costs of maintaining these weapons were prohibitive. The war had devastated Europe's infrastructure, and resources were in short supply. The destruction of these weapons was often an afterthought, secondary to the urgent need to rebuild Europe's civilian economy. In Germany, Particularly, the sheer scale of the destruction meant that there was little room or manpower to deal with the remnants of the war machine. The V weapons, like many other military technologies of the era, were simply discarded or melted down for scrap. In the broader context of European reconstruction, however, there were other, more subtle effects. The V weapons had been the product of an immense mobilization of resources and technology. Their destruction or repurposing was part of a larger pattern of post-war economic realignment. With the war over and the need for weapons diminishing, Europe turned its focus to rebuilding its civilian economy, and the heavy industry that had been geared towards wartime production began to shift to peacetime uses. In many ways, the disappearance of the V-weapon stockpiles symbolized the end of an era, the era of total war, and the beginning of the long and painful process of recovery.